After what's been going on for the past few years, you need to start making some wise financial decisions. If you're feeling lost and don't know where to start, we got some quick tips from an expert for you. Let's hear what financial astrologer Mitchell Scott Lewis has to say.
2023 is a particularly volatile year with 3 of the major planets changing signs. People want to know, what can I do to improve my financial world? What can I do to improve my retirement fund? Believe me, I made money. I knew nothing about Wall Street, commodities, or anything else. And because of astrology, my very first trade found the top of the cotton market. And I made thousands of dollars within 2 weeks of going on the floor. What I hope people get out of this webinar is some useful tools. By the end of the series, I would like people to have a good indication of how astrology works in the financial markets, a usable concept about how they can go about making trades and investments for themselves. And I believe that astrology will allow you to do that.
So, are you feeling inspired to make 2023 the year of your financial transformation? Just head to astrologyhub.com/outlook to start making some wise financial moves right now. Mitch has been helping his clients for over 30 years, so you can rest assured you'll be in good hands. Again, it's astrologyhub.com/outlook, and I hope to see you there.
Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom, and I'm your weekly horoscope columnist here on Astrology Hub. And this week, I wanted to talk to you about Mars coming out of retrograde on January 12th. Now, Mars has been retrograde in the zodiac sign of Gemini since October 30th. And basically, a Mars retrograde, well, like any planet which has turned retrograde, when a planet has turned retrograde, it is said to behave in the way that is opposite than the way that it normally behaves. So that's one understanding of retrograde. So for instance, if Mars is very assertive or very aggressive or goes on the attack, it's not going to be as assertive, it's not going to be as aggressive, and it's not going to be as willing to go on the attack when it is retrograde or moving backwards in the sky. The other thing that a planetary retrograde can refer to is a regression. That is a return back to a situation that maybe you had finalized or had just struggled free of, or thought that you really never had to deal with again. It can sort of be like, I'm going to step out the front door and move into my tomorrow and make my tomorrow today, and you sort of like jauntily step outside the front door. You're going to live your best new day forever on that particular day. And then the storm clouds break and there's thunder and lightning and you go running back inside again. Okay, so it's this notion of regressing or going back to retrograde, something that a place that you were before, or a state, a mental state, a spiritual state, an emotional state, or a situation that you were before. So a retrograde is slipping back down into or moving back towards that situation again. So essentially, a Mars retrograde can signal a lack of progress. What a Mars retrograde can also signal is a failure of nerve. Now, the blunt way of putting it, and many medieval astrologers did put it, cowardice. Okay, so that was a failure of nerve. That Mars retrograde could bring about of cowardice or cold feet, where one suddenly doesn't want to be moving forward, but turning around and running in the opposite direction. But I actually prefer the term failure of nerve, because what failure of nerve can be is all of a sudden a loss of that ambition, a loss of that confidence, or a loss of that drive. Now, we've seen many cartoons where, a character is like, I can smack him down and I'm going to take him on. And, he's not bigger than me. And he turns around and then you see the looming shadow of the opponent, as the character's eyes grow wide with terror and they begin trembling in their shoes. Okay, so there's that sort of failure of nerve that can occur. But also what can be a failure of nerve, and what some of you might have experienced, was, as I was saying, that sudden evaporation of self-confidence. Leaders can often find themselves in these situations where they've worked really hard, they've been very ambitious, they've been very driven, and they've worked very hard to reach a position of leadership. And then they reach that position of leadership and they act as a leader, maybe for a number of months, maybe for a few years. And what happens over a period of time is they go from someone who was driven to achieve that end to more of a political creature, someone who, listens to the input of others and relies on others' counsel and advice, and where they kind of represent the status quo in a company or a culture or a state or a country. And so they represent the status quo, and without realizing it, they've lost that audacity that a leader needs to have. They make safe choices. They begin to make deals with other people. They try to appease others. They try to sell them on different favors or trade in on favors or things like that. And so what can happen is that over a period of time, unless a leader has really sort of like kept honing their leadership instincts, there can be a failure of nerve, of not wanting to make a reckless decision because, well, what's this group of people going to think about it, or that group of people are going to think about it? I don't know. I don't want to make something that I don't want to decide something that's going to be too risky or too reckless, so that over a period of time can be a failure of nerve. So you might have experienced in this time since October 30th, not only, lack of progress, or if you were trying to launch something, a failure to launch, but you also might have really experienced a failure of nerves, that something that that you've always been good at and very confident about, that all of a sudden you were second guessing yourself or relying on other people's input and maybe putting their opinions ahead of your own. Mars is a planet which really, it sets its sight on a target, it sets its sight on an aim, and it goes after it. Okay, so there's a wonderful sort of single-minded focus to the planet Mars. And Mars's job is to get us what we want. We don't say like, oh, I'd love to have that, or I wish so-and-so would fall in love with me, or maybe I could make my feelings known, or I'd really like that position. I hope my record speaks for itself. No, Mars is like, do you want that position? And you say, well, yes, I will. Then Mars is like, okay, well, then let's go after it. Let's make it a thing. Let's go. Okay, so Mars is like going to go after that position. Mars is going to sit down with the boss, which can be very uncomfortable, and say, I want this position. Mars is going to make the pitch to the client who looks down their nose and things like this. Mars is going to say what it feels about someone that it feels very drawn and attracted to. This is what Mars does. It sets its sight on something and it pursues it. And this is something that we actually really celebrate and applaud, with the planet of Mars, a planet that's so associated to contests and fights and duels, and may the best man or woman or human being or dog win. Okay, so these are the things that Mars is all about. It's about the race, the contest, coming in first and being the best. But as I said, Mars really relies on a single-minded focus, and it does well in elements where there is a single-minded focus. And as you might imagine, the element that Mars does have a very difficult time in is air. Okay, now why does Mars have a difficult time in air signs? Mars has a difficult time in air signs because air signs are by nature not single-minded in their focus. Okay, air signs by their nature, because this is the element that rules over relationship and conversation and asking for people's feedback and input and doing surveys. Air signs are very much about try and understand what the other person thinks. Okay, air signs. This is why air signs ask questions. They're like, well, what do you think? What would you like to do? What is something that would really be like, would really be your idea of like the best time ever? Okay, so air signs are always asking people questions, also information about themselves. What are your likes, dislikes, favorite hobbies, etc. Okay, and air signs do this because by collecting information on the relationship itself, they figure out what to talk about, what not to talk about, when to push, when not to push, and their thinking is always we oriented. Okay, it's including another person in the thinking. This is why, for instance, Mars is in fall in the zodiac sign of Libra. Mars is at home in Aries because Aries is I want that. And when Mars is in Libra, Mars is being forced to work with a partner. It's being forced to work with someone else. Mars doesn't necessarily like to work with other people. Mars wants to go after what it wants on its own. Okay, so Mars can have difficulty with being in the zodiac sign of Libra because it has to think in terms of a partnership. What's good for the partnership, the relationship itself. Mars can have difficulty. It's neither here nor there dignity-wise in Aquarius, but Mars can have difficulty in the zodiac sign of Aquarius because Aquarius is very much about what's good for the needs of the group. And so Mars in Aquarius can sort of take on a little bit of a militant flavor. It's committed to what's the good of the group, as in the whole group, the big picture, and all of those sort of Spartan, self-sacrificing of personal needs and never showing weakness can come across in Aquarius as being a little bit doctrinaire or a little bit ideological. This is what serves the state. This is what serves the group. Everyone needs to fall in line. So this is where Mars in Aquarius can take on a bit of a militant edge. What does Mars do in Gemini? Okay. Well, obviously, you sort of think of like Geminis. What do Geminis do? Geminis are kind of like kids. In fact, they rule over. Gemini is very much associated to early education, childhood education, the things that you learn on the playground that you don't learn at home. One of the things that you learn on the playground is that the playground isn't home. Whereas home, you might have been ignored as a kid. You might be an outstanding dodgeball player on the playground and a real star, or at home where you might be celebrated and favored and adored by your parents. On the playground, you might be, sort of shoved to one side or ignored or, even mocked or harangued. Okay, so the idea of the playground, being different from the home, Gemini being different from Cancer, for instance. Okay, this is something to sort of keep in mind when we start to think about Mars and Gemini. But the other thing that we can sort of add to this idea of Mars and Gemini, and remember, if you have your Mars in Gemini, your sun doesn't necessarily have to be in Gemini. You could have your sun in Capricorn, or you could have your sun in Leo and have a Mars in Gemini. Okay, so Mars in Gemini, Mars wants to go after what it wants. It wants to be able to do it with a single-minded focus. And Gemini is always into like, well, what do you think or what do you want? And so this is actually how the two of them sort of come together. When you have Mars in Gemini, the only reason you want something is because somebody else wanted it first. Okay, so with Mars in Gemini, it's kind of like, you're sort of into something, sort of not into something, but if a best friend of yours or a sibling is really into something, all of a sudden it translates to you as being something valuable, as being something good, as being something worthwhile, like I should be into it, and so now you're going to be into it now that, your best friend or your brother or sister is into it. So this only wanting something because somebody else wants it, quality of Mars and Gemini, well, that's probably been going on since childhood. Maybe it began with, I don't know, beating out your brother for the place on the football team. Okay. Or maybe it began with beating out your sister for the boyfriend's hand. Okay. That maybe your sister had voiced interest in someone and you were kind of like, oh, wow, that must make that person really desirable. I'm going to go for it. And then like beating the sister out for the boyfriend's hand, or maybe a friend of yours was really nervous about, I don't know, auditioning for the school musical or something like that, and said, "Can you come with me?" And you were like, "Sure," and so you go with your friend, and your friend's at the musical, auditioning, and they prepare this song, and they're like, "As long as he needs me," and you're like watching, and then you're thinking, I can do this. So, so your friend goes and sits, and they're like, "Well, is everyone auditioned? Who's going to audition?" And maybe as a Mars and Gemini, you raise your hand and they invite you up, and you're like, "As long as he needs me," with Cockney accent and things like that. The song's from Oliver. But anyway, and then they're like, "Oh my God, that's so wonderful. You're cast as Nancy in Oliver Twist," or something like that, or memories. I don't know, like Mars and Gemini. Maybe it's an Ethel Merman thing, but, just sort of like, I'm going, and then all of a sudden you get the role. So your friend's looking at you like, and you're like, "What?" You're just sort of like, stepped on in, I got the role, that's a great thing. And your friend like bursts out crying. And it's like, "I was supposed to do the role." And you're like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And secretly thinking there's no way that you could have done that role. We couldn't even hear you over the piano, but this is something that people with Mars and Gemini often find themselves. These are the sorts of dilemmas that people with Mars and Gemini often find themselves in, that there's like this sudden moment of like, I can do that better, and you go and do it and you win. And then that friend or that sibling or that person that meant a lot to you is completely heartbroken, and you're the reason for it. Now, and what that talks to is this knack that people with Mars and Gemini have with emerging with other people's prizes. It's kind of like, the Labrador dog emerging with the stick in the mouth. You emerge with other people's prizes, and they're hurt and they're disappointed, and maybe they feel betrayed. And for you, the funny thing is that it wasn't about winning, because winning's kind of disappointing. It was about really showing that you could do it, and actually, if you could give back, the position on the football team, or the boyfriend, or Nancy and Oliver, you would, you wouldn't think twice of it, but the damage has been done, and that's not what's going to happen. So this is something that people with Mars and Gemini often have a problem with, and it's the taking the things that other people really want without really meaning to, and then afterwards having to somehow justify it, well, I was better in this football position than you were, or me and the boyfriend made a better fit, or I could belt out the number and you couldn't. But those excuses sound manufactured and ultimately weren't really the reason you did it. You did it simply because you got excited about someone else wanting something, and you realized that would be a cool thing to want, and that's it. So it kind of sounds rather simple and even a bit innocent, but very hard to explain to people whom you have bested. So this is the way that Mars can sort of flex its muscles and do what it wants to do. This is why people who have Mars and Gemini, it's always a really good idea that instead of going after the thing that your sibling wants or your best friend wants, try going after the thing that a rival wants or an opponent wants. Okay, that's much better. Okay, so if a rival really, wants something, or an opponent really wants something, and that these are dreadful people, you could just go after that, and you can beat them at their own game, and of course, when we're talking about Gemini, we're talking about games, we're talking about play. Gemini is the zodiac sign of play. And so if you can beat a rival or an opponent at their own game, then that's all right, because you didn't really like them and they didn't really like you. And they'll retaliate by challenging you again, and you get to play again. And this is, the game's afoot, the game is on. This is a good thing. And so this is actually a very healthy way to direct that Mars in Gemini energy. Just focus on taking away things from people that you don't like, and you'll probably be fine. Now, what we're really talking about here today is Mars coming out of retrograde. And so Mars, as I said, comes out of retrograde on January 12th, and you've been dealing with, we've all been dealing with Mars being in retrograde since the end of October. Okay, so Mars retrograde is going to impact you if your zodiac sign is in Gemini, if your moon is in Gemini, and also if your rising sign is in Gemini. Okay, so you might also have dealt with this Mars energy very, very powerfully. And so now Mars retrograde, what would that have done? We've talked about that can be failure of nerve, failure to launch, this feeling of going back the way that you came, or returning to a situation that you thought you had been freed of. And so that might have been something that you've been struggling with since the end of October. But Mars retrograde may also have put you in a position where you had something that someone else wanted. You know how we just said, Mars in Gemini doesn't know if it really wants something unless somebody else wants it. Okay. So with a Mars retrograde in Gemini, actually, you might have had something that somebody else wanted, and someone was gunning after that, with you. And so this is kind of a simple way of describing. You might have felt yourself suddenly transported back to the playground of childhood, where you were dealing with a bully who was harassing you or trying to steal your lunch money or something along those lines. Maybe you were even dealing with something that was even worse. Okay, so this idea of bullying, or not rising to the confrontation, there might have been a challenge or a confrontation that took place from late October to now, in which you would have felt very much like you're being bullied, and you would have felt very much like, I don't have to deal with this. I don't want to deal with this. I'm not going to. And so if the situation continued, then that's because when Mars is retrograde, it has a tendency to attract hostility. When Mars is moving forward, it's flexing its muscles, it's asserting itself, it's saying, I want that, and it's, going out and taking it, and it's sharp elbows and heavy stomping feet, it will walk over people to get what it wants. This is Mars, what it's supposed to do. When Mars is retrograde, then there is this feeling of almost like weakness, it's like sharks smelling the blood in the water, or someone sussing out a weakness in someone else. And so there's an alertness, and it kind of like brings up the alertness in other people's Mars, and so there can be, a challenge of your status, a challenge of what you own, a challenge of what you believe in, a challenge of your feelings. This can happen with Mars retrograde. It attracts that sort of hostility. If you think about, and it's really not all that nefarious. I mean, if you think about, again, the playground, the setting of the playground again, or actually, let's think about like National Geographic, which you can get on Disney Plus. I don't know. But anyway, like that's what I watch when I can't get to sleep at night, when I'm like, it's too groggy to follow the Korean rom-com. And so it's like the alternative is the National Geographic Animal Show. And, you'll see things like, the little lion cubs and cheetah cubs, they're at play and they frolic and things like that on the African plain. And it looks really sweet. It's like, oh, the cheetahs are frolicking. They're at play on the African savanna or something like that. Well, they're at play and they're frolicking. That's all very true. But they're practicing their hunting techniques, okay? They are practicing their hunting techniques. So, they might be like, oh, it might be a mock fight and they're showing teeth and claws and things like that. And it looks innocent when it's small, but we all know one day they're going to get bigger and they're going to mean business, and they're going to be taking down things like wildebeests and gazelles and zebras. Okay, so like what started out as play on the little African savanna has now become gnashing teeth with blood and taking down the wildebeest. Okay, so and then eating them raw. Okay, so there's that. One can slip into the other. And what can happen when you have basically what can be described as a weak Mars? And I resisted that because that can sound a little like weak Mars, but Mars is actually about power. And so when it's about power and it's retrograde or in ill aspect, the weakness becomes an issue with Mars, at least to the person exhibiting the Mars energy. And so a weak Mars can signal, you can walk on me, or you can take me down on the African savannah, or something like that. And so that's how a retrograde Mars can attract that kind of hostility. And again, it's Mars has to assert itself, and what the retrograde Mars is actually bringing the energy to make it assert itself. But that's a whole story for a whole other time, or a whole other talk on the planet Mars. But let's just leave it with this idea that a retrograde Mars can signal, like a weakness or hesitation. And it's something to be aware of. And that might very well have been your experience during this period of time since October 30th. There's also another, and of course, what the retrograde Mars is forcing you to do is to stand up for yourself. And you may stand up for yourself in a way that's very Gemini, which is to outwit or outmaneuver or to outthink your opponent. Okay, a Mars in Gemini isn't necessarily someone who's going to be Sluggo or Popeye or something like that. It's a Mercury ruled sign, so it's going to be very much about outsmarting and outwitting and outthinking, even if you think that you can't. The other thing that's also associated to a Mars in Gemini, and perhaps even a Mars retrograde in Gemini, is the idea of sophistry. Sophistry comes from a school of sophists in ancient Greek, in ancient Greece. And what they did is that they were famous for teaching people to debate both sides of an argument. Okay, this is something that goes on in the court of law. Okay, or any sort of debate. Like, you have an argument, this is the argument, and then you debate one side. And then sophists, as they taught their students, would say, okay, you debate, why this is good for Athens, and then you debate why this is not good for Athens. Okay, so sophistry, when it became part of educating the citizens of Greece, taught people how to debate one side and then how to debate another. And at first that seems kind of like, oh, wow, that's great. Like how smart, how clever, and things like this. But over a period of time, it became associated with fallacious arguments. It became associated with deception. It became associated with bamboozling someone or confounding someone. I'm going to talk you out of what you believe to be true. And so that's where sophistry took on a much more manipulative and sort of nefarious reputation. If you go and look at the etymology of sophist or sophistry, it basically means a wise man or an expert. But what happened over a period of time is that sophists could confound, and they could deceive, and they could persuade people to believe the opposite of what it is that they believed. And so this can be a Mars and Gemini type of attribute. And so, and this is why, for instance, Mars and Gemini, this is why people who have Sagittarius or Pisces can have difficulty with Mars and Gemini, okay? Because Sagittarius and Pisces, simply put, are signs all about belief and conviction. They don't want their beliefs being messed with. And so Mars and Gemini can be like, well, why do you believe that? And they can poke holes in beliefs, and they can, quote stats and facts and things like this, and turn words around. And this is something that Sagittarians and Pisces do not like, and might have been something that, if you were Sagittarius or Pisces, you were experiencing as well. Virgos, on the other hand, are very amused by this aspect of Mars and Gemini. They can, and that's because Virgo is a Mercury ruled sign, just like Gemini is, and they love a good debate, and so they're very amused when Mars and Gemini starts doing this. But at the same time, they can become quickly annoyed after a while. If this kind of like debating both sides goes on for a while, they can become quickly annoyed because they're not big fans of people being contrary for contrary's sake. And that's what can happen with a Mars in Gemini. I'm going to take on the opposite position just to take it on. It's this idea of being contrary for contrary's sake. And that's something that Virgo, being an earth sign, finds very annoying, because ultimately, when you're contrary for contrary's sake, you are unproductive. You are not getting anything done. All you're doing is having an argument. And Virgo is an earth sign. It's like, we need to get things done. And what did you produce today? Arguing and confusing your classmates is not part of the objective. Where's the homework? Where's the assignment? Where's what you did? But what hopefully you're getting from this idea is that play teaches you how to fight with Mars and Gemini. Play teaches you how to fight like, animal cubs on the African savannah, and how to fight verbally in terms of honing your verbal skills. What makes play? What makes play is rules. And unsupervised, lots of nasty things can happen on an unsupervised playground, okay? But if there are people in attendance and, we used to call them yard duties back in my day, but people, out there making sure that everyone's playing nicely and fairly, well, then the play proceeds nicely. This is what referees are supposed to do in football games, is to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand and to call penalties and things along those lines. So play, you can push the envelope with play, okay, but it needs to stay within the rules, okay? That's what makes play. If it goes outside the rules, or if you remove the rules, then play becomes basically hurt and pain, and that people aren't just losing, they're being hurt and harmed, and play is no longer playful. It's become something dangerous and violent. Okay, so now that we're coming out of this Mars in retrograde on January 12th, and so this period of time when Mars is still in Gemini, what I want you to reflect on are some of the things that I've just talked about. But this is sort of the idea that I want to conclude with, or leave you with, for Mars and Gemini, now that Mars is moving forward in Gemini. Someone once said a very long time ago that everything they learned in kindergarten. And what do we learn in kindergarten? We learn how to share. We learn how to play. We learn how to put things back where they belong. We learn how to put things back where we found them, okay? And we also learn how to lose. Not everyone's going to win the game, and so you lose, and so we learn how to lose. These are the things that we learn in kindergarten. These are important life lessons because they teach us how to get along with others who aren't always going to see things in the same way that we do. That's something I want you to keep in mind between January 12th and March 25th, when Mars finally leaves the zodiac sign of Gemini.
Thanks for tuning in to the Astrology Hub Podcast Network. If you love the show, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, review, and share it. And if you don't know how to do that, here's how you can leave a review in Apple Podcasts on iPhone. Make sure you're on the landing page for the Astrology Hub podcast and not an individual episode. Scroll down to the bottom until you reach ratings and reviews. Click one of the 5 stars under Tap to Rate to leave a rating, and under the most recent review, tap the Write a Review button. And if you're on another device, just find out how to leave a review on whatever podcast player you use. Then, share what you love about the show or how it helps you navigate your life. We'd love to hear your stories. And by doing this, you make it possible to make shows like Horoscope Highlights happen every week. Thank you again for tuning in, for being a part of our community, and for making astrology a part of your life.